trying to solve a giant, really complex puzzle. Some pieces want to just zoom ahead, build things super fast. While other pieces, they want to slow right down, protect things, conserve our environment. It's this constant tension, right?
Right, it really is. And that kind of push and pull, well, it's pretty much what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now with this huge, huge bill called H.R. 1.
Yeah, massive.
It's more than just your average bill. It's like a whole vision for where the country should go, laid out with different paths, you could say.
Different paths.
Yeah. Each path has its own set of priorities, about our resources, the economy, the environment, and the potential outcomes.
Yeah.
They could stretch way into the future. It's basically a blueprint for national policy, and figuring out the different parts is, well...
It's crucial. And that's exactly why we're here today. On the deep dive, we're going to really dig into H.R. 1. We're focusing specifically on one really key section, Title V.
Right, the energy part.
Exactly. This is where it gets down to the nitty-gritty on energy and natural resources. We've got a stack of detailed reports, government analyses, expert comments. We're looking at everything, the arguments for energy independence, the, serious environmental impacts, and even, believe it or not, how new tech, like artificial intelligence is, like playing this surprising role in the whole thing.
Yeah, the AI angle is pretty unexpected there.
Totally.
So our mission today really is to unpack this complex thing for you, our listener. We want to help you sort of cut through the jargon, understand the different viewpoints shaping the bill, and really explore what these proposed changes could actually mean for our country's energy future, our environment, even the job market. It's about getting you well-informed, fast, and clear so you can, really engage with these conversations.
Absolutely. Okay, let's really unpack this beast. So let's start with H.R. 1 itself. Like you said, it's not just any bill. It's actually called the Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Right, quite a name.
And that name kind of hints at the scale. This isn't some little tweak. It's a massive, sweeping budget reconciliation package. Think of it like a master plan, touching pretty much everything the government does, trying to reshape how a big chunk of the country runs.
It is incredibly broad, and it's already been on quite a journey, which tells you something about how significant and maybe how controversial it is. It passed the House of Representatives back on May 22nd, 2025.
Okay.
Then, a different version, you know how that works. The Senate puts its own spin on things, passed the Senate on July 1st, 2025. So now it's heading back to the House for more discussion, maybe ironing out the differences between the two versions. It's that classic legislative back and forth.
The legislative dance, yeah. And it really does touch so many areas. Like you flip through it and there's Title II that's about military quality of life, cybersecurity, really critical stuff.
National security.
Then you've got Title III proposing big changes for banking, how banks operate, and even Title VII that gets into tax changes. It's just enormous. A huge legislative lift.
Definitely. But for our deep dive today, like you said, we're zeroing in on Title V. This is the section where the bill really tackles how the U.S. gets its energy, how it manages resources, our natural landscapes. Yeah. It's the blueprint for, well, everything from oil and gas drilling on public lands and offshore to how we manage forests, and even, as we mentioned, the role of new tech in all these decisions. Title V is basically setting the stage for a lot of our resource policy for years to come.
So just to give everyone a clearer picture of what's actually in Title V, let's break down the main parts. It's kind of helpful to see the pieces. First up is Subtitle A. That's all about oil and gas leasing. Yeah. Onshore, offshore, the rules for that, how much companies pay for methane, the royalties, and even special rules for places like Alaska, which has, tons of energy resources.
Got it. So drilling focus there.
Pretty much. Then you move to Subtitle B, and that's focused on mining. Mostly coal leasing, the terms for getting coal out of the ground, and the royalties, the money paid to the government for mining rights.
Okay, coal and minerals. Makes sense.
Then, Subtitle C shifts over to lands. This covers things like timber harvesting, how we manage forests for wood products. It also gets into fees and revenue from renewable energy projects like big solar farms or wind turbines on federal land, how that money is handled and shared, plus a bunch of other land-related stuff.
Right, renewables on public land, that's a big one too.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. We hit Subtitle D, which is broadly about energy policy itself. It covers the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, our emergency oil stockpile, how we keep that maintained.
ESPR.
It also repeals various existing energy policies, which signals, a change in direction. But here's the curveball. Subtitle D also has this really fascinating section on artificial intelligence. We'll definitely circle back to that.
Yeah, definitely want to unpack the AI part later. Seems out of place at first glance.
Right. And finally, subtitle E rounds out title V. This one's all about water. Things like water conveyance, how we move water around, pipelines, canals, and improving water storage, which is obviously super important, especially out west.
Absolutely. Water infrastructure. So yeah, Title V covers a massive amount of ground. Energy, minerals, forests, water, AI. It's all in there.
So, with all that packed in, the big question Title V seems to be grappling with is, well, it's fundamental. Should the U.S. lean more on traditional energy like oil and gas? Are the policies designed to speed that up? Or is it more about trying to fix rules that maybe slow down all kinds of energy development, including renewables?
That's the core tension, isn't it? Is it prioritizing one type or trying to streamline the whole system? And that really sets up the different viewpoints we need to explore.
Okay, let's dive into that first path, the one often framed as unleashing American energy dominance. The argument here is pretty clear. Boosting domestic oil and gas production isn't just about fuel. It's seen as absolutely vital for America's strength, our security, and cutting down how much we rely on other countries for energy.
Right. It's framed as energy independence.
Exactly. The idea is use the resources we have right here at home.
And from that strategic angle, it really becomes a national security issue. If the U.S. produces more of its own energy, it's less vulnerable, less vulnerable to global politics, supply chain messes, or countries using energy as a weapon. Self-sufficiency, they argue, makes America stronger, more able to act independently on the world stage. It's presented as a crucial step.
And alongside that security argument, there's a big economic piece too. Jobs and money, basically.
Huge economic driver.
Proponents say a strong domestic energy sector means lots of jobs. Drilling, transport, processing, all of it. And it brings in serious money, not just for companies, but for the government, for states. Look at Alaska, for example. In 2019, oil and gas there brought in $3.1 billion for the state and local area?
Oh, $3.1 billion.
Yeah, and supported over 77,000 jobs. That's like a quarter of all the jobs in Alaska then. Shows you the scale of the impact.
That Alaskan example is powerful. Those revenues were critical for their state budget, like 38% of their general fund. And get this, 90% of all the state revenue from businesses came from oil and gas that year.
90%.
Yeah. And nationally, it's significant, too. In fiscal year 2024, federal lands generated over $8 billion in revenue from oil and gas. That's from 605 million barrels of oil and over 4 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So proponents point to these big numbers as proof of the economic and fiscal benefits.
So, okay, given that argument, how does H.R. 1 actually try to make this unleashing happen? It seems to be through some pretty direct mandates and changes. Let's start with onshore oil and gas leasing.
Right.
The bill wants to undo some recent changes, like repeal the higher royalty rates from the Inflation Reduction Act. Royalties are, the fees companies pay to drill on public land.
The government share.
So bringing those rates back down makes it cheaper, more attractive for companies to drill. That's the idea. It also looks at ending something called non-competitive leasing.
Beyond the money side, H.R. 1 gets really specific with mandates for the Secretary of the Interior, who manages all that public land. The bill would actually require the Secretary to hold a minimum of 4 oil and gas lease sales every single year in 9 specific states.
4 sales a year in 9 states. Which ones?
Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Alaska. And it's not just symbolic sales. Each one has to offer at least half of the available land. That's a really strong push to open up land for development.
That is a demanding schedule. And it seems they've thought about potential roadblocks, too.
They have. If a sale gets canceled or delayed, maybe because of a lawsuit or maybe not enough bids come in, like if less than 25% of the land gets a bid, H.R. 1 says a replacement sale has to happen in the same fiscal year.
Wow. So no excuses for slowing down, basically.
Pretty much. It really emphasizes a consistent pace of leasing, trying to prevent delays.
And it sounds like there's a similar push for offshore oil and gas leasing.
Very similar, just as ambitious, maybe even more so. The bill mandates at least 30 region-wide lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico by certain dates, and no fewer than 6 sales up in Alaska's Cook Inlet area.
30 sales in the Gulf. That sounds like a lot.
It is. And the acreage is huge, too. At least 80 million acres offered in the Gulf and 1 million acres offshore Alaska. These are vast areas they want to open up for potential drilling.
And are they adjusting the offshore royalty rates, too, like they did for onshore?
Yes, same approach. H.R. 1 would amend the law to set offshore rates between 12.5% and 16.67%.
Yeah.
And again, crucially, this repeals previous higher rates. The goal is the same: lower the cost for companies, encourage more offshore activity, create a predictable environment for the industry.
Okay, let's swing back to Alaska specifically because the bill seems to really focus there. Areas like the coastal plain and ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, that 1002 area, and the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, the NPRA.
Right, areas Congress has flagged as having massive potential, and H.R. 1 gets extremely specific about them. For the coastal plain, it demands at least 4 lease sales within 10 years. Each sale has to offer at least 400,000 acres, targeting the spots with the most potential for oil and gas.
And the money for Alaska, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, the revenue sharing is significant. Alaska gets 50% of the money from those coastal plain programs from 2025 to 2033. Then it jumps up to 70% from 2034 onwards. That's a huge incentive for the state.
70% is a lot. And what about the NPRA?
Similar story. The Interior Secretary has to hold at least 5 lease sales there within 10 years, each sale offering a minimum of 4 million acres. The first sale has to happen within a year, and then more sales every 2 years after that. Again, incredibly prescriptive. Not much wiggle room left for the agency.
It's not just oil and gas, though, right? The bill pushes for more mining, too.
Correct. It extends to domestic coal and hard rock mining. The big driver here is strategic, trying to rely less on other countries, especially China, for critical minerals and rare earth elements. You know, the stuff we need for phones, computers, even green tech.
Right, the supply chain concerns.
Exactly. And it connects back to a previous policy. President Trump's Executive Order 14241 designated coal as a critical mineral and told agencies to remove barriers to coal production. H.R. 1 reinforces that by permanently reinstating the federal coal leasing program. It signals a long-term push for domestic coal.
Okay, and what about forests? There's a timber harvesting piece, too.
Yes, and it's framed primarily around wildfire risk, with over 1 billion acres at risk from wildfires nationally and 117 million federal acres at high or very high risk.
No.
Well, the bill proposes a direct solution.
Which is?
It directs agencies to increase timber harvesting by 25%, tying it to a presidential executive order. Proponents see this as killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Improve forest health by clearing out potential fuel, which hopefully cuts down on firefighting costs, and also generate money from the timber sales. Proactive management, they call it.
Gotcha. So a lot of focus on boosting extraction across the board. Now, a huge part of making that happen seems to be about changing the environmental review process, specifically NEPA reform.
Absolutely. This is a really significant component of this whole approach. The perspective driving this part of H.R. 1 is that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, while maybe started with good intentions, has become, in their words, cumbersome and lengthy.
Meaning it slows things down too much.
Exactly. They argue it leads to higher costs and major delays for all sorts of projects, roads, bridges, energy infrastructure, you name it. It's seen as a major bottleneck.
Are there stats to back that up? I feel like I hear about NEPA delays a lot.
There are. NEPA is often called the most frequently litigated environmental statute, meaning it gets sued over more than any other environmental law. And when someone does sue over an environmental impact statement, an EIS, that big report NEPA requires,
Right, the EIS.
it takes, on average, 4.2 years just to resolve the lawsuit.
Yep.
And the reports themselves. The average EIS is 575 pages long. That's way longer than the original guidance suggested, which was maybe 150 to 300 pages.
575 pages on average. Wow. And how long does it take to actually do the EIS before any lawsuits?
That's another big number. The average time to complete an EIS is 4.5 years. And for a quarter of them, it takes over 6 years.
6 years just for the environmental review.
Yeah. Even for things that seem more routine, like forest treatments or prescribed burns to reduce fire risk, NEPA adds years. Mechanical treatments take an average of 3.6 years to start. Prescribed burns, 4.7 years. If you need an EIS for those, it jumps to 5.3 and 7.2 years, respectively. And then there's this backlog, over 5,000 oil and gas permits waiting, some for over a year, blamed on NEPA delays. Proponents see this as directly hindering energy production.
Okay, so H.R. 1 tries to fix this perceived problem. How? What are the proposed reforms?
The aim is to provide more certainty, they say, for developers and agencies. One key change tries to limit when agencies can demand new scientific research. It says research should only be required if it's really essential to making a reasoned choice between project options.
Trying to stop research being used as a delay tactic?
That seems to be the intent. The bill also sets deadlines. After a certain point, new scientific info generally won't be considered in the decision. This is aimed at stopping continuous delays due to late arising information, trying to create a clear finish line for the review process.
And what about the lawsuits? You said NEPA gets sued over a lot.
Right. H.R. 1 makes a big effort to limit what it calls frivolous litigation lawsuits, maybe aimed more at delay than substance. It would restrict who can sue over NEPA decisions. Basically, you'd have to have participated in the public comment process and raised specific issues then.
So no jumping in at the last minute with a lawsuit if you weren't involved earlier.
That's the idea. It would also block lawsuits challenging categorical exclusions.
Yeah.
Those are actions predetermined not to have significant environmental impacts.
Okay. Anything else on the court side?
Yes. It tries to make it harder for courts to just stop projects. A court could only halt or throw out an agency's NEPA decision if there's a clear finding of substantial environmental harm. That sets a higher bar. And it imposes deadlines on the courts and agencies too. 180 days for agencies to fix problems, 180 days for courts to rule on NEPA lawsuits, all about speed and certainty.
And there's also a part that specifically targets recent policies, right, from the Biden-Harris administration.
Correct. There's a joint resolution mentioned, HJ Res 168, that aims to completely get rid of the Biden-Harris administration's NEPA Phase 2 rule and prevent similar rules later.
What's the criticism of that rule?
Critics argue that the agency overseeing NEPA, the CEQ, ignored calls to streamline things and added new requirements, things about climate change, environmental justice, community engagement.
Things they say weren't in the original law.
Exactly. They argue these additions are not in the underlying statute and just create more red tape, litigation, and permitting delays. The concern is that this rule helps speed up things like wind and solar, but makes it way harder. They use the word munnifying for oil and gas projects. It highlights that fundamental disagreement over balancing environmental review and energy development.
Okay. And finally, this path also focuses on protecting existing leases and funding traditional energy.
Yes, absolutely. H.R. 1 has provisions to protect leases that are already signed and finalized, preventing them from being improperly canceled. This provides stability for companies, ensures revenue keeps flowing, and supports ongoing production without sudden policy shifts yanking the rug out.
Makes sense. And the funding part.
That ties into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. The bill sets aside $218 million for maintaining it, keeping it ready, and another $171 million to actually buy oil to put into the reserve to build it back up.
So refilling the emergency stockpile.
Right. And importantly, it also repeals a previous mandate that required selling oil from the reserve. So the focus shifts clearly back to maintaining the SPR as a strategic safety net, not using it for other purposes, like managing gas prices or raising funds.
Okay, let's switch gears now and look at the other side of this coin. The perspective focused on protecting our planet and future. This view raises some really serious concerns about the approach in H.R. 1, especially its focus on boosting traditional energy extraction.
Right. For many environmental groups, like the National Parks Conservation Association, the NPCA, this bill is more than just problematic. They see it as a direct threat. They're actively urging a no vote, even calling it a vote against America's national parks. That's strong language.
A vote against the parks. Why such a strong stance?
It boils down to a fundamental worry about how our public lands are managed. For decades, the policy has been multiple use, meaning public lands are for lots of things: hiking, hunting, fishing, conservation, and responsible resource development.
Kind of a balance.
Exactly. But critics fear H.R. 1 would tip that balance heavily, making drilling and mining the dominant use, pushing everything else aside. They see it as a major shift away from that long-standing multiple-use principle, potentially changing the whole purpose of these shared lands.
And they're worried about direct harm to the parks themselves, even if the drilling isn't in the park.
Yes, very much so. They stress that parks aren't isolated islands. They're connected ecosystems. What happens nearby, more drilling, more mining can spill over. Rushing environmental checks like H.R. 1 proposes could, in their words, really harm our national parks, the animals that live there, and even our clean water.
What kind of harm are they talking about specifically?
Things like increased risk of severe wildfires, potentially made worse by land management changes, the spread of invasive plants that can choke out native species, habitat destruction. And specifically with mining, even if it's outside park boundaries, it can pollute the air and water that crosses park boundaries. Think contaminated rivers or hazy air affecting park vistas and health.
So pollution doesn't stop at the park border.
Exactly. And they also point out that H.R. 1 would actually require surveying for minerals and fuel, even in lands that are already protected with special designations, like wilderness areas. They call this a needless exercise that directly threatens these important natural and cultural spots we've decided to protect.
Beyond the immediate park impacts, there's the climate change argument, too.
A huge one. Critics argue strongly that pushing for more drilling and mining especially in sensitive areas, will inevitably make climate change problems worse. They see it as moving backwards, away from cleaner energy like wind and solar, effectively pushing us back on climate action when we need to be accelerating.
Is there a specific part of the bill they point to regarding climate?
Yes, the repeal of the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, or MERP, is
Yeah.
a major concern. That program targets methane leaks from oil and gas sites. And methane, it's a super powerful gas that traps heat, much more potent than CO2 in the short term.
Right, the super pollutant.
So, getting rid of a program designed to cut methane emissions is seen as directly undermining efforts to clean the air and fight climate change. It would likely lead to more heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere.
Okay, so environmental harm, climate concerns. What about the money side? Does this perspective see impacts on conservation funding?
Absolutely. A key point is the lowering of those oil and gas royalty rates we talked about earlier back to 1920 levels. Critics say slashing the fees companies pay means less money for critical conservation funding programs that depend on that revenue stream.
Which programs rely on that money?
Some really important ones, like the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund, that's from the Great American Outdoors Act, meant to fix the huge maintenance backlog in parks. Also, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which protects natural areas and creates parks and trails, and the Historic Preservation Fund. Plus, states often get a share for things like schools and health services.
So less money for park repairs, land protection, historic sites, maybe even state budgets.
That's the argument. They also say lower rates make it cheaper for companies to drill, maybe encouraging more of it. And they worry about bringing back non-competitive leasing, where land might get leased out for half price, cutting public revenue even more.
Are there also worries about direct cuts to park operations, like funding for rangers and stuff?
Yes, very specific concerns there. Section 5305 of H.R. 1 proposes cutting $267 million meant for critical staffing at the National Park Service. This isn't just bureaucracy. It's funding for rangers, emergency responders, curators, preserving artifacts, scientists studying ecosystems.
$267 million cut from park staff. That sounds like a lot, especially if they're already underfunded.
Exactly. Critics point out the Park Service has been chronically underfunded and already faced hiring freezes and staff leaving. On top of that, the bill cuts $12 million dedicated to helping parks prepare for floods, fires, storms, things happening more often with climate change. These cuts, they argue, would seriously weaken the Park Service's ability to protect our parks.
Are other agencies affected by funding cuts in the bill?
Yes. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is another example. H.R. 1 would cut unspent funds for NOAA programs that help coastal communities become more resilient to storms and fund work at marine sanctuaries, like restoring coral reefs in Florida.
So less help for coasts facing storms and sea level rise.
That's the concern. And another cut that raises alarms is in Section 6004 and 6016, which repeal funding for air monitoring across the country.
Air monitoring, like checking air quality.
Exactly. Critics call this data a vital source of information that serves to keep the public safe and well-informed about the state of the air quality in parks and communities. It's crucial for public health, especially for kids or people with asthma. Cutting this funding means communities might not know when the air is unsafe.
Wow. Okay, are there any other threats to protected areas mentioned, maybe from less obvious parts of the bill?
Yes, Title IX of H.R. 1 allocates a huge amount, $46.5 billion, for more border wall construction.
The border wall. How does that connect to parks?
Well, over 800 miles of wall already exist, and a lot of it cuts through public lands, including sensitive places like Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. Critics say building even more wall could be devastating for the 6 national parks right along the border.
Devastating how?
Threats to sacred indigenous sites, damage to water sources in dry areas, blocking wildlife migration corridors, fragmenting habitats, and just ruining the visitor experience in these parks. It shows how different parts of a big bill can have unexpected overlapping impacts.
Right. Okay, finally, how does this perspective see H.R. 1 affecting the shift to clean energy?
They argue it actively hinders it. They contrast the bill's focus on fossil fuels with the idea that real energy independence comes from more clean energy wind, solar, things that are sustainable long-term.
And they see specific parts of H.R. 1 slowing down renewables.
Yes, particularly the changes to renewable energy fees on federal land. Right now, all the fees from solar and wind projects go just to the federal government, unlike oil and gas, where states get a share. H.R. 1 proposes setting renewable fees back to pre-Biden-era levels. Critics worry these potentially higher fees could make it harder and more expensive to build clean energy projects on public land.
So paradoxically, it might lead to less renewable development and maybe less revenue overall.
That's their concern. They see it potentially clashing with state and federal clean energy goals, slowing the transition.
This perspective sometimes mentions alternatives, right? Like a carbon tax. How does that fit in?
Right, a carbon tax isn't in H.R. 1, but it's often brought up as a different path. It's basically a fee on pollution. Some studies suggest it could seriously cut emissions maybe 13% by 2028. And it would likely boost wind and solar, potentially adding 139 gigawatts of new capacity, while encouraging older coal and gas plants to retire.
And the money from the tax, does it just go to the government?
Not necessarily. A key idea is making it revenue neutral. The money collected could be returned to people or businesses through tax cuts elsewhere. So you shift incentives to favor clean energy without necessarily increasing the overall tax burden. It's a very different approach to balancing the economy and the environment.
Okay, let's shift to that surprising element we mentioned earlier, artificial intelligence showing up in Title V, the energy section of HR 1. It feels a bit like one of these things is not like the others, right?
It does seem like an unexpected connection at first glance, AI and energy policy, but it's there, specifically in Section 50404, called Transformational Artificial Intelligence Models.
So what's the connection? How is AI relevant here?
Well, the core idea, from the perspective that includes it in the bill, is that AI could be a tool to seriously speed things up. Remember how we talked about environmental reviews and permitting being seen as big delays for energy projects?
Yeah, the NEPA process taking years sometimes.
Exactly. The thinking is that AI could make those reviews much more efficient, helping to cut through the perceived red tape, using tech to streamline regulation.
Is this just theoretical or is it actually happening?
Oh, it's already happening. The Department of Energy, the DOE, has a $20 million project right now specifically to build and test AI tools to speed up permitting. One part is called Policy AI, and it's focused directly on NEPA reviews.
Wow, $20 million for AI in permitting.
Yeah, and places like Pacific Northwest National Labs have already gathered
All right.
28,000 documents from past NEPA reviews into a database that AI can search and learn from. That's a massive amount of data to train an AI on how these reviews work.
Okay, so before we go further, maybe we should quickly clarify what generative AI is, because it's different from, say, the AI that recommends movies, right?
Good point. Yeah, traditional AI is mostly about analyzing data, finding patterns, making predictions, like your spam filter. Generative AI, or Gen AI, is a huge leap. It can actually create new, original content, text, images, code that looks like the stuff it was trained on. It's not just analyzing, it's generating.
So it writes things or makes pictures.
Exactly. It's built on things like machine learning, getting computers to learn from data, neural networks, computer systems kind of modeled on the brain. And for language, natural language processing, NLP, is key.
Okay.
Then you have things like generative adversarial networks, GANs, which got really good at making realistic content. And most recently, what everyone's talking about, large language models, LLMs, like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Anthropic Claude.
Right, I've heard of those. How do they work?
Basically, they're trained on unbelievable amounts of text, the internet, books, articles. They learn patterns in language and then predict the most likely next word and the word after that and so on. That's how they generate sentences and paragraphs that sound coherent and relevant.
Okay, so how does that apply practically to energy law and policy? It still seems like a jump.
Well, think about streamlining communication. Gen AI could take a bunch of bullet points about a new rule and turn it into a press release instantly, or summarize a super long court decision or federal order into a few paragraphs. It could even make tables comparing the pros and cons of complex bills, making them easier to understand.
That actually sounds pretty useful. What about the legal side?
Huge potential there for enhancing legal processes. Energy law is complex, full of jargon. Gen AI can help decode that, summarize regulations quickly. It could review contracts, maybe even help calculate the legal weight, the probative value of evidence. As it gets trained on more legal documents, it might even help draft new ones faster.
Okay, I can see that. And for lawsuits, litigation support.
Definitely. AI could analyze legal arguments, maybe predict outcomes, simulate practice court sessions. Think about getting AI feedback on your presentation before you go to court. Or, like that example you mentioned, Google NotebookLM, turning a dense FERC rule to a short podcast. That makes complex stuff way more accessible for everyone.
Yeah, that podcast example is wild. What about the government agencies themselves? Can they use it for regulatory compliance?
That's a big area of exploration. Agencies like DOE and FERC are looking at AI for efficiencies. FURC mentioned it in their budget request, using AI across different program offices. Maybe it helps them process applications faster, review compliance filings more quickly, could potentially shorten those regulatory timelines we talked about.
And you mentioned it could help smaller groups too, democratizing access.
That's one of the really exciting possibilities. Gene AI could potentially level the playing field. Smaller companies, community groups, environmental justice organizations, groups that maybe can't afford teams of lawyers and experts, could use AI tools to analyze complex documents, understand impacts, translate things, even draft comments on regulations. It holds the promise of making these processes more accessible to everyone.
Okay, that all sounds potentially great, very efficient. But there have to be risks or downsides, right? Especially using AI for important government stuff.
Oh, absolutely. There are significant key risks and ethical challenges.
Mhm.
A major one is accuracy. AI can sometimes just make stuff up. It's called hallucinations.
Hallucinations, like the AI sees things.
Not literally sees things, but it generates information that sounds plausible, but is completely wrong, completely fabricated. That means you absolutely cannot blindly trust AI output for legal or policy work. Human verification is essential. A person has to check the facts.
Okay, that's a big one. What else?
Confidentiality and data security. If you feed confidential information into an AI model, where does that data go? Some systems might use it for training unless you explicitly opt out, which often costs more. Lawyers and agencies have to be super careful about security, data policies, privacy. NDAs might need specific clauses about AI use now, too.
Right, you wouldn't want sensitive info getting leaked through an AI. What about ethics?
Several ethical use and transparency issues, like using AI to secretly record client calls. Even if legal somewhere, many feel it's unethical, a betrayal of trust. Then there's the black box problem, the lack of explainability. If an AI makes a recommendation, but you can't understand why, how can you trust it? How can a court review it? This ties into worries about hidden bias in the AI's programming or data.
So, decisions without clear reasons, potential bias.
Mm.
That sounds problematic for government actions.
Exactly. And it leads to fundamental questions about governmental accountability and due process. Agency decisions have to be based on solid evidence and reasoning. If a decision relies on a flawed AI or an algorithm nobody understands, does it meet that standard? It also touches on the non-delegation doctrine. Can Congress let an AI make decisions without enough human control? The general legal thinking is AI should inform rather than determine decisions. Humans need to stay in charge.
So, AI as a tool, not the decision maker.
Precisely. And one more thing, copyright. AI-generated stuff currently doesn't get copyright protection in the U.S. because it wasn't made by a human. Plus, there are lawsuits about whether AI training infringes on existing copyrights. That's still being sorted out.
Okay. And how will courts handle evidence generated by AI?
That's a developing area. There's a proposed new rule, Federal Rule of Evidence 707, that would treat AI-generated evidence like expert testimony. It would have to be proven reliable, and the other side can challenge it, just like with a human expert. It's about ensuring fairness as technology evolves.
So wrapping this all up, it's really clear that H.R. 1, especially this Title V on energy and resources, it's this incredibly complex balancing act for the country.
It really is. You've got this strong push on one side for energy independence, economic growth, jobs,
Wow.
often looking to streamline things, maximize traditional resource use.
Right, the unleashing energy dominance path.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you have this equally strong imperative for environmental protection, conservation, dealing with climate change, fearing long-term damage to nature, funding cuts, and worsening the climate crisis.
We're protecting our planet path. And now woven into all of this is this new factor, technology, specifically AI.
Yeah, it's fascinating how tech like AI is becoming part of these policy debates. It offers potential for making things faster, more efficient, maybe even fairer by improving access to information. But, as we just discussed, it brings a whole new set of risks and ethical questions that need really careful thought. Governance, oversight, and ultimately keeping human judgment in the loop are going to be critical.
So it's definitely not about picking a simple right or wrong side here.
Not at all. It's about understanding the really complicated trade-offs involved, recognizing the different values people hold, and thinking hard about the long-term consequences of the choices we make for our economy, our environment, our future. It demands a lot of nuanced thinking. Hashtag tag tag outro.
So as you think about everything we've dug into today with HR 1 and Title V, here's something to mull over. How do you personally weigh those immediate needs, energy security, economic growth, against the long-term health of our planet and preserving our natural places? What kind of energy future do you want to see for the country? And what role should big policy decisions like this bill and powerful new technologies like AI play in getting us there responsibly?
It's a conversation that really does affect all of us. Understanding the different angles, the different arguments, that's the first step to being able to participate in shaping that future.
Absolutely. Keep asking questions, keep digging for more information, and keep thinking critically about this incredibly complex world we live in.